The Convergence had been classifying species for approximately 12,000 standard cycles, and in that time, they'd gotten pretty damn good at it. Or so they thought. Their methodology was flawless, really. Take a species, examine their physiology, observe their behavioral patterns, run them through a few stress tests, and slot them neatly into one of 47 categorical rankings. Simple, effective, foolproof, except when it wasn't. The problem with the Convergence's classification system, as it turned out, was that it relied heavily on first impressions. And first impressions, as any decent philosopher would tell you, are about as reliable as a Vexorian's promise to repay a debt. Which is to say, not at all. Humans had been classified as a Category 7 species. For context, Category 1 housed things like the Krethax, 8-foot-tall reptilian nightmares with retractable bone blades, acid saliva, and a cultural philosophy that roughly translated to might makes right, and we have all the might. Category 7, on the other hand, was reserved for species that posed approximately the same threat level as a decorative houseplant. The Convergence's official designation described humans as bipedal, socially oriented, technologically derivative, and possessing negligible predatory capabilities. That last part was going to age like milk in a supernova. The Convergence sprawled across 48 star systems, each one governed by a representative from the apex species of their respective worlds. The whole thing operated on a might-based hierarchy that would have made ancient Spartans nod approvingly. If you were big, tough, and scary, you got a seat at the table. If you were small, soft, and prone to forming emotional attachments, you got to sit in the corner and look grateful for being included. Humans, naturally, were sitting very firmly in that corner. The Krethax held the position of supreme arbiters, which was a fancy way of saying they ran everything and everyone else had to deal with it. They'd earned this position through a combination of natural advantages that made them the galaxy's undisputed champions of violence. Enhanced musculature, redundant organ systems, an exoskeleton that could deflect most small arms fire, and a complete lack of what other species might call empathy or basic decency. They were, by every measurable standard, the apex predators of known space. Their homeworld, Krethax Prime, was a hellscape of volcanic activity, toxic atmosphere, and fauna that had evolved in an arms race of mutual attempted extinction. To graduate from childhood to adolescence, young Krethax had to survive alone in the wilderness for 30 days. Those who made it back were considered full members of society. Those who didn't became fertilizer. It was into this culture of ritualized brutality that the Convergence had decided to introduce an educational exchange program. Because nothing says, let's promote cultural understanding, quite like throwing teenagers from soft, peaceful worlds into an academy that measured success by survival rates. The Krethax Battle Academy sat in the mountains of Krethax Prime's northern continent, a sprawling complex of stone and metal that looked less like a school and more like a fortress preparing for a siege, which, given the surrounding wildlife, wasn't entirely inaccurate. The student body consisted of approximately 200 of the Convergence's warrior species, each one there to prove their worth and earn prestige for their homeworld. And then there was her. The human stood 4 feet and 11 inches tall, weighed maybe 90 pounds soaking wet, and possessed all the physical intimidation of a particularly unthreatening kitten. She had pale skin that burned if she stood in direct sunlight for more than 20 minutes, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and eyes that seemed far too large for her face. By Krethax standards, she looked like an hors d'oeuvre that had wandered away from the buffet table. Her name was Keiko Tanaka, and she was about to rewrite the Convergence's entire understanding of predation. The first 2 weeks had been, in a word, humiliating. Not for Keiko, who maintained an expression of polite interest through all of it, but for anyone watching who possessed even a shred of decency. The Krethax students treated her with the kind of patronizing condescension usually reserved for pets or particularly slow children. They laughed when she struggled to lift training weights that they manipulated with one hand. They snickered when she needed breathing apparatus to survive in the toxic atmosphere that they found refreshing. They made jokes about her soft skin, her small teeth, her complete lack of natural weapons. Keiko smiled through all of it, took her notes, and said nothing. The Krethax instructor, a scarred veteran named Thrascor, who'd lost his left eye to a Vexorian blade and wore the empty socket as a badge of honor, had initially protested the human's inclusion in his class. "This is an academy for warriors," he'd hissed to the administration, his forked tongue flickering with disgust. "Not a daycare for prey species." But the Convergence had insisted, and so Keiko stayed, a tiny anomaly in a sea of scales, claws, and barely suppressed violence. The other students came from a variety of warrior species. There were the Vexorians, 6-limbed insectoids whose reflexes operated at roughly 3 times normal perception speed. The Dracnoth, massive bear-like creatures with electromagnetically charged fur that could deliver stunning shocks. The Yulani, aquatic predators who could breathe both water and air, and whose skin secreted a paralytic toxin. All of them were bigger, stronger, and better armed than the human. All of them knew it. The whispers followed Keiko through every corridor. "Why is it even here? I heard it can't even digest raw meat." Apparently their species still practices agriculture. Can you imagine? The laughter was constant, a background hum of mockery that would have broken lesser spirits. Keiko just kept smiling. The Survival Crucible was announced during the 3rd week of term. It was the Academy's signature exercise, a 4-day simulation in a hostile environment where students were divided into teams and forced to compete for resources while avoiding environmental hazards and, more importantly, each other. Success was measured by survival. Excellence was measured by how many competitors you eliminated. The rules were simple, elegant, and absolutely brutal. Each student would be dropped into a randomly generated jungle environment spanning roughly 50 square kilometers. They'd be given basic survival gear, a knife, a canteen, and a beacon that would summon extraction if triggered. Triggering your beacon meant failure. Being rendered unconscious for more than 30 seconds meant failure. Elimination of other students was encouraged, but not required. The simulation would run for 96 hours, after which all surviving students would be extracted and ranked based on performance. Thrascor explained all of this with the enthusiasm of someone describing their favorite hobby, which, to be fair, it probably was. "This exercise separates the predators from the prey," he announced, his remaining eye gleaming with anticipation. "It reveals your true nature. Some of you will discover you are apex hunters. Others will discover they are merely food with delusions of adequacy." His gaze lingered on Keiko when he said that last part. The Krethax students were practically vibrating with excitement. This was their element, their proving ground. The Vexorians were calculating angles and strategy. The Dracnoth were flexing their considerable muscles. The Yulani were testing their toxin glands, secreting small amounts of paralytic to ensure proper function. Keiko was doing stretches, basic, simple stretches, toe touches, arm rotations, neck rolls. She looked like someone preparing for a light jog, not a multi-day survival exercise in a hostile simulation designed to test combat capability. One of the Krethax students, a particularly large specimen named Krethax, who stood nearly 9 feet tall and possessed acid glands that could dissolve steel, sauntered over with the confidence of someone who'd never faced a real challenge in his life. "Tell me, little human," he hissed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do your people have a saying about knowing when you are outmatched? Perhaps you should trigger your beacon now. Save yourself the embarrassment." Keiko looked up at him, her expression pleasantly neutral. "We do have a saying, actually, about counting chickens before they hatch. But I don't think the translation would make sense to you." Krethax laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Chickens. Prey animals, yes? How appropriate." He leaned down until his massive head was level with hers, his breath reeking of sulfur and rotting meat. "I will find you in the simulation, little human, and I will show you what happens to prey that wanders too far from safety." "I look forward to it," Keiko said, and went back to her stretches. The insertion pods launched at dawn, streaking through the simulated atmosphere and depositing students at random coordinates throughout the jungle. The environment was a masterpiece of sadistic design. Dense vegetation that restricted visibility, terrain that ranged from swamp to steep mountainside, and programmed fauna that was just dangerous enough to keep students on edge without actually killing them. Probably. Keiko landed in a clearing near a river, her pod disintegrating into recyclable components as per design. She took exactly 45 seconds to survey her surroundings, another 30 to check her gear. And then she was moving, not running, walking. A steady, purposeful pace that suggested she had somewhere to be, but wasn't in any particular hurry to get there. The first few hours were quiet. Students were spreading out, establishing territories, making plans. The Krethax doctrine emphasized aggressive expansion and territorial dominance. The Vexorians preferred high ground and ambush positions. The Drachnoth were natural trackers who excelled at pursuit. Each species played to their strengths, following patterns that had been refined over millennia of evolution. Keiko found a tree, a nice, sturdy tree with good visibility of the surrounding area. She climbed it, not with the natural grace of an arboreal species, but with the determined competence of someone who'd practiced the skill until it became reliable. Once she was 30 feet up, comfortable in a branch junction that provided good concealment, she pulled out her canteen, took a measured sip, and waited. Waiting was, after all, something humans were extraordinarily good at. The first contact came 6 hours into the simulation. A Vexorian scout named HFY, moving through the canopy with the rapid, jerking movements characteristic of his species. He was hunting, his compound eyes scanning for any sign of movement, his mandibles clicking with anticipation. He never looked up. Humans, as it turned out, were persistence hunters, not ambush predators like the Krethax, not speed hunters like the Vexorians. They were endurance specialists who excelled at one thing, not stopping. In Earth's evolutionary history, humans didn't chase prey by being faster. They chased prey until it died of exhaustion. But that didn't mean they couldn't adapt. Keiko waited until HFY was directly below her position. Then she dropped her canteen. Just dropped it. The metal container fell 30 feet, struck the Vexorian directly on his primary sensory cluster, and produced a satisfying crack of chitin. HFY shrieked, more in surprise than pain. And that was when Keiko dropped on him. 90 pounds moving at terminal velocity isn't much, unless it's concentrated on your spine, unless it comes from an angle you weren't watching, unless it's followed by a knife blade that finds the gap in your exoskeleton with surgical precision. HFY went down hard, his elimination beacon activating automatically when his vital signs dropped below safe parameters. Keiko retrieved her canteen, wiped her knife on some leaves, and was climbing back into her tree before the extraction pod arrived. First blood, approximately 6 hours into a 96-hour simulation. The monitoring instructors, watching from their comfortable observation chamber, began paying much closer attention to the human's feed. The second elimination happened 14 hours later. A Dracnoth named Krethax, tracking what he thought was an injured student based on irregular movement patterns through the underbrush. He followed the trail for 2 kilometers, his electromagnetic sense attuned to the nervous system activity he was tracking. What he didn't realize was that he was the one being tracked. Humans, you see, had another evolutionary advantage that most species overlooked. They were exceptional throwers. Absurdly good, really. Something about their shoulder structure, their binocular vision, their ability to calculate trajectory and timing. On Earth, humans could take a rock and hit a target at 50 meters with enough force to cause serious damage. In a galactic context, where most species had evolved without ranged capabilities, this was approximately equivalent to having a built-in artillery system that no one saw coming. Krethax never knew what hit him. One moment he was following his prey, the next a fist-sized rock moving at roughly 60 kilometers per hour impacted the side of his head. He stumbled, dazed, and that was when Keiko emerged from the underbrush. The fight lasted 12 seconds. Dracnoth were strong, but they were also slow. Keiko wasn't trying to overpower him. She was just staying out of reach of his electrically charged claws while systematically targeting pressure points and joints with her knife. Hamstring, shoulder tendon, the soft tissue behind his knee. Not fatal strikes. Just precise applications of force that turned his considerable strength into a liability. When his beacon activated, Krethax was conscious enough to feel the humiliation. The tiny human stood over him, not even breathing hard, and gave him a polite nod before disappearing back into the jungle. The pattern repeated throughout the second day. A Yulani ambusher named Silqua, waiting in a water source to dose unsuspecting students with paralytic toxin. Keiko had approached the water, knelt as if to drink, and then stabbed straight down into the murky liquid where thermal imaging suggested something was lurking. The Yulani's elimination beacon activated before she even breached the surface. A pair of Krethax working together, using pack tactics that had served their species for generations. Keiko had led them on a chase through difficult terrain for 3 hours. Just 3 hours. Humans could run for hours. Krethax, for all their strength, had a cardiovascular system optimized for short, brutal engagements. By the time they cornered her, they were exhausted, overheated, and moving like they were underwater. She'd eliminated them both while barely breaking a sweat. By the end of day 2, Keiko had 7 confirmed eliminations. The monitoring instructors were no longer watching casually. They were studying every move, rewinding footage, analyzing tactics. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Thrazakor, in particular, was having what could only be described as an existential crisis. He'd been teaching combat doctrine for 40 cycles. He knew predation. He knew hunting. He knew what separated apex species from prey species. Apparently, he didn't know a damn thing. "Explain this," he hissed at the Academy's xenobiology consultant, a scholarly Vexorian named Dr. Ziltoth, who specialized in comparative evolutionary studies. "Explain how a Category 7 species is systematically dismantling students from Category 1 and 2 species." Dr. Ziltoth, who'd been watching the footage with increasing fascination, tilted his head in the Vexorian gesture of academic excitement. "I believe we may have fundamentally misunderstood human evolutionary history," he said, pulling up data files on his terminal. Look at their physiology. Really look at it. Thrazkor looked. He saw soft skin, blunt teeth, minimal musculature. Prey features. Now look at their actual capabilities, Dr. Ziltoth continued. Humans evolved on a planet where they were neither the strongest, fastest, nor best-armed predators. So how did they become the dominant species? Persistence hunting. They would chase prey until it collapsed from heat exhaustion. Their sweat-based cooling system is incredibly efficient. They can maintain running speeds for hours, while most predators can only sprint. But they're so fragile, Thrazkor protested. Are they? Their bone density is actually quite impressive for their size. Their healing capability is remarkable. They can survive injuries that would incapacitate most species. And that's just the physical aspect. Dr. Ziltoth pulled up more data. Their brains. Look at their neural structure. Pattern recognition capabilities off the charts. Spatial reasoning that allows them to throw objects with accuracy no other species can match. Social cooperation that enables complex tactical planning. They're not apex predators despite their physiology. They're apex predators because of their cognition. Thrazkor stared at the screen, watching as Keiko orchestrated another elimination. She'd set up a simple trap using nothing but rope and gravity. Not sophisticated. Didn't need to be. A Yulani student had triggered it, found himself dangling upside down from a tree, and activated his beacon when Keiko had simply walked away, leaving him hanging. Literally. They don't look dangerous, Thrazkor said, his voice hollow. That, Dr. Ziltoth replied, is precisely what makes them dangerous. Day 3 began with Keiko's toughest challenge yet. Krethax, the massive Krethax who'd threatened her before the simulation, had been hunting her specifically. He'd figured out that she was the human. He'd seen the elimination count. He'd made it his personal mission to put her in her place. He found her near a rocky outcropping, apparently resting in the afternoon heat. Perfect. He approached with all the confidence of a predator that had never been prey, his acid glands primed, his bone blades extended. I told you I would find you, little human, he growled, moving to block her escape routes. And now you will learn what happens to those who forget their place in the natural order. Keiko looked up at him, her expression unreadable. You know what's interesting about the natural order? She said conversationally. It's constantly changing. Species that dominated yesterday are extinct today. Advantages that worked for millions of years suddenly become liabilities when the environment shifts. Krethax laughed. Philosophy will not save you. No, Keiko agreed, standing up with a fluidity that should have been a warning. But physics will. Then she ran, not away from him. That would have been logical, expected, reasonable. No, she ran at an angle, moving across the rocky slope with the sure-footedness of someone who'd planned this exact scenario. Krethax followed, because of course he did. He was bigger, stronger, faster over short distances. This would be over in seconds. Except it wasn't. Because Keiko wasn't trying to outrun him. She was trying to exhaust him. For 2 hours, she led him on a chase through the most difficult terrain in the simulation. Up slopes that required scrambling. Through narrow passages where his bulk was a disadvantage. Across streams where she could maintain her footing, and he had to slow down to avoid losing his. She was always just out of reach. Always visible enough to keep him engaged. Always moving. Humans, it should be noted, could sweat from almost every part of their body. This was an insanely efficient cooling system. Krethax, like most reptilian species, relied on behavioral thermoregulation. They could handle high temperatures through metabolic adjustment, but sustained exertion in heat was not their strong suit. By the end of hour 2, Krethax was moving like he was wading through syrup. His breathing was labored. His movements were sloppy. His acid glands had stopped functioning properly due to dehydration. He could barely lift his bone blades. Keiko, meanwhile, was just getting started. She turned to face him, and for the first time since the simulation began, she wasn't smiling. "You wanted to know about human sayings?" she asked, pulling out her knife. "Here's another one. It's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog." The fight, if it could even be called that, lasted about 30 seconds. Krethax was too exhausted to mount any real offense. Keiko just kept moving, kept striking, kept targeting the vulnerable points in his armor that were exposed by fatigue. When his beacon activated, he actually looked relieved. Elimination was better than whatever this was. The monitoring room was completely silent. Dr. Ziltoth was frantically typing notes. Thrazkor was staring at the screens like they'd personally betrayed him. "Recommend immediate reclassification of humans," Dr. Ziltoth said quietly. "They're not Category 7. They're not even Category 1. "Then what are they?" Thrazkor asked. Dr. Ziltoth pulled up the classification matrix, highlighting the criteria for each category. Size, strength, natural weapons, speed, all the physical markers that the Convergence used to rank species. According to our current system, they don't fit. They shouldn't be apex predators. But they are. They're what happens when intelligence becomes the ultimate weapon, when strategy matters more than strength, when endurance trumps speed. So, what do we classify them as? I don't know. But I know one thing. Dr. Ziltoth gestured at the screen, where Keiko was calmly checking her gear, preparing for the final day of the simulation. We made a very serious mistake inviting them to prove themselves, because now they have. The last day of the simulation was almost anticlimactic. The remaining students had formed a fragile alliance specifically to deal with the human threat. 12 of them, representing the best of their respective species, coordinated their efforts to corner and eliminate the tiny terror that had been picking them off one by one. They set up ambush points. They established communication protocols. They created overlapping fields of fire and mutual support positions. It was a textbook operation, the kind of thing that should have worked against any single opponent, regardless of capability. Should have. The problem was that humans had been waging war against each other for thousands of years. They'd refined tactics, strategy, and psychological warfare to a level that most species couldn't comprehend. Keiko wasn't just a persistence hunter. She was a tactician who understood that the greatest weapon wasn't strength or speed. It was fear. For 6 hours, she simply avoided them. Let them wait. Let them second guess. Let them start wondering where she was, what she was planning, when she would strike. Human psychological warfare wasn't about direct confrontation. It was about making the enemy defeat themselves through paranoia and exhaustion. By hour 7, the alliance was fraying. Accusations of cowardice, arguments about strategy, the kind of internal conflict that happens when fear and frustration meet exhaustion. That's when Keiko struck. Not directly. She triggered environmental hazards, simulated rock slides that scattered formations, disturbances in water sources that suggested movement, sounds in the darkness that could have been threats or could have been nothing. Each one calculated to increase stress, decrease cohesion, turn allies into suspicious rivals. By hour 10, the alliance had collapsed. Students were acting independently, jumping at shadows, activating beacons voluntarily rather than face whatever psychological torment the human was inflicting. When the simulation ended at the 96-hour mark, Keiko was sitting by a stream, boiling water for tea using a method she'd learned from survival manuals. She'd eliminated or caused the elimination of 23 students. Not through superior strength, not through natural weapons, just through patience, intelligence, and the kind of endurance that came from millions of years of persistence hunting. The extraction pod arrived, and Keiko climbed in, still holding her cup of tea. The Academy's response to the Survival Crucible results was, in a word, chaos. There were calls for investigation, accusations of cheating, demands for simulation review. Surely the human had somehow manipulated the program. Surely there was an explanation that didn't involve a complete reevaluation of galactic threat assessment. Dr. Siltoth presented his findings to the Academy Board 3 days after the simulation ended. He'd compiled a comprehensive analysis of human evolutionary history, physiological capabilities, and tactical doctrine. His conclusion was simple. Humans were apex predators wearing a disguise of harmlessness. They'd evolved to hunt prey that was bigger, stronger, and better armed. They'd become dominant through intelligence, endurance, and a terrifying ability to simply not stop. We classified them based on physical appearance, he explained to the board, which consisted of the most decorated warriors from various apex species. We saw soft skin, small teeth, minimal natural weapons, and categorized them as prey. We didn't look at what they actually did with those characteristics. We didn't consider that intelligence could compensate for physical disadvantage. We didn't understand that their evolutionary path made them uniquely suited to defeating species that relied on physical dominance. "So what do you propose?" asked one of the board members, a scarred Krethax matriarch who'd led military campaigns across 3 systems. "Reclassification to Category 1, minimum. Potentially a new category entirely, and," Dr. Siltoth added carefully, "a significant revision of how we interact with human diplomatic envoys. Because if their students can do this, I don't want to imagine what their actual military is capable of." The board agreed, unanimously, quickly, with the kind of speed that suggested they'd all watch the simulation footage and come to the same terrifying conclusion. Humans weren't harmless. They'd just been polite. Keiko, for her part, returned to her regular classes as if nothing had happened. She continued to struggle with the physical training that came naturally to other species. She continued to require breathing apparatus in the toxic atmosphere. She continued to be smaller, softer, and apparently more vulnerable than every other student in the academy. The difference was that now, when other students saw her in the corridors, they moved aside. Politely, carefully, with the kind of respect usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. Thrazkor approached her after class one day, his remaining eye studying her with new appreciation. "I misjudged your species," he said bluntly. Krethax didn't do apologies, but they respected directness. I assumed physical dominance was the only measure of predatory capability. Keiko smiled, the same pleasant smile she'd worn since arriving at the academy. "That's okay. Most people do. It's kind of our thing." "Your thing?" "Looking harmless, being underestimated, winning anyway." She shrugged. "My species spent millions of years being smaller than the things we hunted. We got good at compensating." Thrazkor was quiet for a moment. "The Survival Crucible is considered our most challenging exercise. Students from Category 1 species have failed it. How did you find it?" "Honestly?" Keiko adjusted her breathing apparatus. "Easier than I expected. You should see gym class back home." She walked away, leaving Thrascore to contemplate a universe where humans considered multi-day survival exercises less challenging than their standard physical education. The Convergence's revised classification of humans was published 2 months later. They created a new category, Category 0, specifically for species that didn't fit traditional assessment criteria. The official description read, "Technologically advanced, socially sophisticated, physically unimposing species whose primary survival strategy relies on intelligence, endurance, and tactical flexibility. Extreme caution advised." The informal description, the one that circulated among military strategists and diplomatic corps, was much simpler. "Don't let the cute ones fool you. They're persistence hunters wearing a smile." Human enrollment in Convergence academies increased dramatically following the incident. Other species wanted to understand these creatures that looked like prey but thought like predators. Humans, for their part, were just happy to be included. They attended classes, made friends, participated in cultural exchanges, and generally acted like the pleasant, social species they'd always appeared to be. But every now and then, when a particularly arrogant Krethax or overconfident Vexorian got too comfortable with their assumptions about physical dominance, they'd find themselves matched against a human in some kind of competition. Combat simulation, strategic exercise, survival challenge. And every single time, they'd learn the same lesson Krethax had learned in that simulation. Looking harmless and being harmless are two very different things. Keiko graduated top of her class. She returned to Earth, completed her standard education, and eventually joined the Human Diplomatic Corps. Her specialty was first contact situations, particularly with species that had aggressive or hierarchical social structures. She was very good at her job. Something about her made even the most intimidating alien species listen when she talked. Years later, when the Convergence was negotiating a trade agreement with a particularly difficult warrior species called the Vexorians, they sent Keiko as their representative. The Vexorians were huge, violent, and convinced of their own superiority. They treated the negotiation like a formality, certain that they could intimidate the Convergence into accepting unfavorable terms. Then Keiko walked into the room. The lead Vexorian negotiator, a massive creature covered in scar tissue and ceremonial battle markings, looked down at her with barely concealed contempt. The Convergence sends a child to negotiate with warriors? An insult. Keiko smiled. That same pleasant, harmless smile. "I'm sorry if my appearance is disappointing. I graduated from Krethax Battle Academy. Perhaps you've heard of it?" The Vexorian had heard of it. Everyone had heard of it. It was legendary among warrior cultures. "You? At the academy?" "Top of my class, actually. I still hold several records." She sat down, pulled out her datapad, and gestured for the Vexorian to sit. "Now, about these trade terms. I think you'll find them quite reasonable. Because the alternative, and I want to be very clear about this, is discovering exactly what happens when you try to intimidate a species that hunted mammoths to extinction using nothing but pointed sticks and patience." The Vexorian sat down. The negotiations proceeded smoothly. Somewhere in the monitoring station, an observer who'd been tracking Keiko's career since her academy days smiled. Humans, he'd learned, were excellent at many things. Diplomacy, science, art, cultural exchange. But what they truly excelled at, what they'd spent millions of years perfecting, was a simple lesson that the rest of the galaxy was still learning. Never assume the harmless-looking thing is actually harmless. Because sometimes, the universe's most effective predators are the ones that don't look like predators at all. They're the ones that look soft and friendly and perfectly pleasant right up until the moment they demonstrate that intelligence, endurance, and strategic thinking are the only weapons that really matter. The Convergence had learned this lesson the hard way. But they learned it well. And across the galaxy, in academies and military installations and diplomatic halls, a new understanding emerged. When you see a human, you don't see a prey species anymore. You see what they actually are. Persistence hunters who traded claws and fangs for brains and endurance. Apex predators who won the evolutionary lottery by learning that the best way to be dangerous was to not look dangerous at all. They looked like schoolgirls. They fought like nightmares. And by the time you realized your mistake, you were already eliminated. The galaxy was a very large place, full of species that were bigger, stronger, and better armed than humans. But size and strength were just physical advantages. They could be compensated for, overcome, rendered irrelevant by something as simple as refusing to quit when any reasonable species would have given up. That was the human advantage, not their technology, not their diplomacy, not even their intelligence, though that certainly helped. It was their absolute, terrifying refusal to accept that they couldn't win just because someone else said so. You could be bigger, stronger, faster, better armed. None of it mattered if the human just outlasted you, just kept coming, just waited for you to make a mistake and then exploited it with the kind of precision that came from millions of years of hunting prey that should have been out of their league. The Convergence had cataloged thousands of species. They'd ranked them, studied them, understood their capabilities and limitations. They thought they knew what made a predator. Then they met humans, and they realized they didn't know a damn thing. Because the most dangerous predator isn't the one with the biggest teeth. It's the one that doesn't need big teeth. The one that figured out how to win without them. The one that looks at you with those big, harmless eyes and that pleasant smile, and waits patiently for you to realize that you've already lost.